There's a couple of cars pulling into the parking lot. Joel is standing guard, so if it's okay with everybody, we'll wait another minute and see if they come in. Because unlike last week, pretty much everybody, I see 3 or 4 people that were not here last week, but last week was comparatively easy stuff compared to what we're going to try to do next, which is Martin Buber. But then we'll go to Mordecai Kaplan, which should be relatively straightforward again. Martin Buber is very, very difficult. If you've looked at the handout on Martin Buber, you'll notice that on the first page, at the bottom it says page 15. Relationship is everything. Of the 2 handouts, that's the one you want. You'll notice there's that little paragraph in the bold print, which is Buber himself, and then a page and a half of explanation. And that's no surprise. Louis Jacobs describes I, Thou as a philosophical poem. And that's because it's written in such a way. I don't know if this is Buber. What I have found going back into the dark ages when I was an undergraduate, way back in 1968, and I started studying philosophy, that the Germans were always very, very difficult to read. I believe that's because of the nature of translating from German to English. And it may just have to do with things about the German language, since I know none of it, that are intrinsic to the language. But most of the German philosophers are very difficult in English. There's some exceptions to that. Nietzsche is very straightforward. So if you're looking for a German philosopher to read, Nietzsche would be a place to start. But people like Buber, but he comes out of the same kind of tradition. Immanuel Kant, I think I mentioned this last week. If you try to read the Critique of Pure Reason, it could kill you. Even though it's a seminal work, one of the critical works in the history of philosophy. So Wittgenstein is a little different. Now we're jumped way into the 20th century. Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who of course was German originally, but he lived in England a long time. And that certainly, he's an interesting character because he thought he solved all philosophical problems in his first work, which is called the Tractatus. He became like a gardener after that because he thought he had solved I'm serious, because he thought he had solved all philosophical problems, and I guess, I'm making this up now, he woke up one morning and went, oh my God, I didn't solve them all, and he wrote another book, essentially with an entirely different approach called the Philosophical Investigations, and that's really what is important about his work. Are the philosophical investigations, where he understood that the key to philosophy was understanding certain things about language. Okay, but all those are other stories for other times from other people who know much more about them. Are we ready to try to start Martin Buber? Now, all of you, I am sure, have heard of Martin Buber because he is one of the seminal religious existential philosophers of the 20th century. And I don't say that just for Jews. He may be more important to non-Jews than to Jews. Certainly, people have heard of his most famous phrase. What's his most famous phrase? It's written at the top of the page, I, thou. He wants to make a distinction between something that he calls I, thou, which the translators choose to use the word thou just to sort of make it feel special, right? So that we focus in on it as a key idea. But it's just I, you, all right? It's not, it's in contemporary English, we would say I, you. and I, it. Those are his, and he plays back and forth between I, it, and I, thou to make what he considers his important points, his contribution, if you will. People have taken his ideas and applied them in all sorts of ways beyond philosophy. I would say most famously it's applied psychologically. Even in Louis Jacobs' explanation, he does that to try to clarify what Buber is all about by sort of explaining it in psychological terminology. And so you may have encountered this in some of your own studies depending on what field you did. How do I mean? We're going to look at this in a second, but essentially what Buber is saying is that you relate as a subject, you the subject, either to an object or to another subject. If you're relating to another object, then it's I, it. If you're relating to another subject, it's I, thou, subject to subject. And so you can see how that becomes a good starting off point for all sorts of things in psychology, in education, about how you approach your students or how you deal with people who objectify the world, or all those kinds of things. And often those ideas will be referred to as either Buberian or sort of Buberian. You'll get that kind of thing. You hear the name a lot. I think he was actually trying to say something theologically. He was trying to say something about God. Okay, now with that as a little bit of introduction, we have to go back a little bit to last week. Remember when we looked at Milton Steinberg, what was he doing? He was arguing it is more reasonable to believe in something called God than not to believe in it. He didn't think he could prove it to you. He'd read his Kant. He didn't think he could prove it to you, but he thought he could make a case that was very convincing. And we looked at that. But he was dealing with your head, with your reasoning. Then we looked at Abraham Joshua Heschel, who had an entirely different approach. He wasn't really interested in your head, in your reasoning ability. He was interested in your experience and what experience matters. That's why he's a religious existentialist. Because he thinks your experience leads you to God if you focus on the right kind of experience. What did he call that experience? Don't all talk at once. Radical amazement. Exactly right. Radical amazement, that the world will not die for lack of information, but for lack of appreciation. He talked about this as radical amazement, being amazed that you can be amazed, that there's anything at all, that there are facts, and that cultivating that sense leads you to the experience of God. So he saw that experience in a theological framework. Hence, he's a religious existentialist. We contrasted him a little bit to someone, say, like Jean-Paul Sartre, who also focuses on experience. He thinks that the experience of the human condition leads you to a nullity, namely that there is nothing out there, that there is no ultimate meaning to the universe or anything else, and it's all just a matter of your choice, which pretty much he thinks is arbitrary, and you just have to make the best of it. A non-religious existentialist, right? Okay, so Buber, we're going to continue in this religious existentialist mode. We okay so far, or did I lose everybody? And I'm asking these questions because usually I'm fairly good at reading faces, but not tonight. Okay. So unless you want to communicate with your eyes, blink once for yes, two for no, something like that, you'll have to talk. Okay, so let's look at this excerpt from I, Thou that you've all heard about, probably have never tried to read. Or if you did try to read it, you gave up on it pretty quickly. Remember, none of these people are sensitive to the gender issues that we're sensitive to now. They're all early, mid-20th century writers. They're all men. That's a limiting factor, but it also is reflected in their language, right? So I'm not really addressing the language issue, right? When he's going to say men where we would say human or something else, but we'll just have to live with it. Here we go. Men have addressed their eternal thou with many names. In singing of him who was thus named, they always had the thou in mind. The first myths were hymns of praise. Then the names took refuge in the language of it. Men were more and more strongly moved to think of and to address their eternal thou as an it. But all God's names are hallowed, for in them he is not merely spoken about, but also spoken to. How is that? Crystal clear? Everybody get it? It's pretty difficult. Exactly what he's going for. It should have helped a little bit that I distinguished the I, it to the I, thou. You at least know that's what he's talking about. If you didn't know that was his theme, you might not even get that. So let's focus for a minute on I, it. What is I, it? I, it is description of the world. Description, the kind of experience when you describe. As soon as you describe anything, you're in I, it. All science is I, it. Right? Whatever you think about science, it's always descriptive. It's measuring, right? It's associating one idea to another. But it's always about something. You don't speak to an atom. You speak about an atom. Does everybody sort of see that? Okay. So then, he wants to say that theologically, there is such a thing as the eternal thou, and the eternal thou has many names. Who is the eternal thou? Now, you realize as soon as I asked the question that way, I framed it as I, it. And that's because, in my opinion, the way I read this, Buber is trying to do something that his own ideas say he can't do. He wants to talk about something that's not about description, but how is he going to write about it and let us know that's what he wants to talk about unless he describes it? Do you follow the paradox that he's in? Okay. So he's going to go about it with this strange language. He's going to talk about names. Why are names important? What happens when you call someone by a name? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. I think actually he is arguing the opposite. When you call somebody by name, you are talking directly to the person rather than about the person. Okay? So having the name of God, which is what he's suggesting, the eternal thou is really God. It's another term for God in Buber. It has many names. You see the trap I'm in. God has many names. Why? Because different human communities over time and over history have used different names to address God, to speak subject to subject. But they're all talking to the same subject. Okay? So whenever there is a name, we have the thou in mind, and he wants to sort of argue for this by showing you things. That's why the first prayers are hymns of praise, in his opinion. Right? Because you're talking to the person. But what happened then? Men took refuge in the language of it, which sounds like something out of Lord of the Rings or something, right? Or the Addams Family. But in this case, what he is saying is men, humans, began describing the experience of talking to God. And as soon as they did that, they would lose the eternal thou. Karen. Try again. This is between the Mass and I think my fading hearing as I get older. It could be. Okay? So what we see clearly here is we're starting with names. I believe, and I'm speaking as one who suffered from this malady, that's why we care so much that people remember our name and talk to us by name. I can't even remember my children's name. I confuse them all the time. And we're blessed to have 9 grandchildren. Simone was calling one of our grandchildren by one of our sons' names the other day because apparently she's much better at it than I am. But why do we care so much when people don't get our name right? Why do we care when the newspaper doesn't spell our name right? Why do we care about any of these things? Because we want to be addressed directly. Not about, but to. So I think that Buber's on to something here. And if you think about this in the educational setting, those of you who are teachers, you know that to teach, you have to establish something like this I-thou relationship with your students, where you connect to them subject to subject. Or if we're talking about a psychologist and a patient, that's the problem with Freudian analysis. What is analysis? It's entirely I-it, right? It's entirely I-it. It doesn't matter what your field is. You can understand what Buber is going for by thinking of it. When I was teaching confirmation class, Aaron may remember this, I asked the kids in the class how many of them had a pet. Because I wanted them to learn what the I-thou relationship is. And I think with younger people, they can understand this more easily to their pet. When you say, other people here have pets? Do we still have pets? Okay, so when I would say, my daughter's dog's name is Bella, I know Bella. Do I know what color she is? No, that's not what I mean. When I say, I know Bella, does that mean I know what her eye color is, how much she weighs, how tall she is, how old she is? That's all I-it. When you say, I know my pet, somehow you are talking about a kind of knowing that isn't descriptive. Now let's take it to something serious. Pets are serious, but something serious if we're talking about a spouse. When I say, I know my wife, do I mean I know how tall she is? She's shorter than she used to be. Do you follow? That's not what we're talking about. When you say you know somebody in the I-thou way, it can't be described. Because if you describe it, it's I-it. You've lost it. That doesn't mean that knowing somebody in the I-thou way isn't knowing. I would argue, I believe this is what Buber was going for, it's the most important kind of knowing. And it has nothing to do with description. It has nothing to do with facts. Indeed, if you are in the moment of an I-thou relationship, the entire world, all of experience is in that moment. Have you had that experience? The best I can do is sort of talk around it like this and hope that you're going to say, oh yeah, I think I get that. Uh-huh. So you can't conceptualize. As soon as you conceptualize, you're into I-it. That's what he said. Men took refuge in the world of it, in the land of it, in the relationship of it, because we try to conceptualize. I would argue it's a natural thing. Buber's not saying that I-it is bad. He thinks that no one can live in I-thou perpetually all the time. Of course, we have to relate to the world as an object. How else do we manipulate the world? And I don't mean that in a negative way. Right? So there's nothing wrong with I-it. There's nothing wrong per se with conceptualization. But it's not I-thou. It's not that kind of knowing. Are we all sort of still together? Or you're out. You're out. You're out, right. Like I said, he can't do what he's trying to do. But somehow he does, meaning by talking around this, using sort of these odd phrases in poetry, we can sort of get at it. Turn the page, please. Every real relation with a being or life in the world is exclusive. Its thou is freed, steps forth, is single and confronts you. It fills the heavens. This does not mean that nothing else exists, but all else lives in its light. As long as the presence of the relation continues, its cosmic range is inviolable. But as soon as thou becomes it, the cosmic range of the relation appears as an offense to the world. Its exclusiveness is an exclusion of the universe, which is what I think Fran was trying to say. That in the moment of I-thou, everything is included in it. And the moment you move out of that, it's lost. In the relation with God, unconditional exclusiveness and unconditional inclusiveness are one. He who enters on the absolute relation is concerned with nothing isolated anymore, neither things nor beings, neither earth nor heaven, but everything is gathered up in the relation. For to step into pure relation is not to disregard everything, but to see everything in the thou, not to renounce the world, but to establish it on its true basis. Buber would have argued you can have an I-thou relationship with, this is going to sound weird, but I don't have any other language. You can have an I-thou relationship with anything. Famously, he describes having an I-thou relationship with a tree. In other words, these are two ways of relating to experience. Every relationship is either going to be I-it or I-thou. It's not a matter of what is on the other end of the relationship. You can experience it as subject, or you can experience it as object. Okay? So therefore, it's all inclusive. The I-thou experience is all inclusive. The entire world gets subsumed in it. So where did I stop? To look away from the world or to stare at it does not help man to reach God, but he who sees the world in him stands in his presence. Here, world, there, God is the language of it. God in the world is another language of it. But to eliminate or leave behind nothing at all, to include the whole world in the thou, to give the world its due and its truth, to include nothing besides God but everything in him, this is full and complete relation. Difficult stuff. He's describing what he can't describe. Men do not find God if they stay in the world. They do not find him if they leave the world. He who goes out with his whole being to meet his thou and carries to it all being that is in the world finds him who cannot be sought. That should have confused you, if nothing else did. What did Heschel say is the existential experience that leads you to God? Radical amazement. What is Buber saying is the existential experience that leads you to God? I-thou. I-thou. Subject to subject relationship. I think he even wants to say, God is what makes the I-thou relationship possible. Every I-thou relationship is with God. Whether it's with your dog or your spouse or a tree. Every I-thou relationship is about God. That's what God is. Subject to subject relation. The ultimate reality of the universe is relationship. Very different way of thinking, don't you think? See why this is so difficult and so very slippery. Of course, God is the holy other, but he is also the holy same, the holy present. Of course, he is the mysterium tremendum. A very famous 19th century philosopher, Rudolf Otto, talked about the mysterium tremendum, you know, the great mystery, the powerful mystery of the universe that's behind the universe. It became a basic religious term, religious philosophical term that appears and overthrows. God is the mysterium tremendum, but he is also the mystery of the self-evident, nearer to me than my eye. How can God, the thou, be nearer to me than my eye? What's really real? I'm listening to myself and it's like, what's really real? The relationship, not the subjects. Subject to subject relationship. That is what's real. That's what encompasses, that's the experience that encompasses it all. If you explore the life of things and of conditioned being, you come to the unfathomable. If you deny the life of things and of conditioned being, you stand before nothingness. If you hallow this life, you meet the living God. So what is, he just changed the vocabulary, but it's the same idea. What is conditioned being? You come to the unfathomable. That's it. If you deny the life of things, that's it. But if you hallow life, what is making life holy? That's I-thou, subject-subject relationship. Okay, so we've been talking about this for half an hour now. What do we think? Is this so overwhelming that there's no opinion? I-you is the same as I-thou. Joel. That's a good question. I think that Buber believed that, just like Heschel, all the existentialists, that if we can just help people see which experiences really matter, they can then focus on them and enhance their lives. Then their life takes on meaning. In other words, if you know that I-thou is what's really real, for lack of a better way of putting this, I wish I could come up with something better, then that becomes something that you want to cultivate, that you want to do. And then you also understand what your religion is all about. Your religion is not about describing God. All that theology, systematic theology, or the quest for reasonable argument, if you're Steinberg or any of these people, all that's irrelevant. Do we ever know God? Well, the answer to that depends on what you mean. If you mean in the I-it sense, no. If you mean in the I-thou sense, the answer is yes, we completely know God, but we can't describe it. Right? It's just like you can more or less, obviously I'm exaggerating, but we completely know our spouse, assuming that, isn't that what we mean by love in terms of the I-thou relationship? And we know that person entirely because the experience is all-encompassing. But it can't be described. As soon as you try to describe it, it's gone. Aaron. I think that's correct. It's also pretty clear, at least to me, that you can't maintain I thou. You have to appreciate it when it happens. You can cultivate it, you can increase it, but you can't maintain it for very long. It's just the way we are, that we relate to the world the way we relate to the world, generally as an object. And certainly I was thinking about science. I think you were thinking about psychology in terms of how we relate to each other. Certainly, if we could relate to each other more and more subject to subject as opposed to subject to object, that would be good. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. That's partly why Buber was so popular, but he is radical. I don't think people appreciate just how radical what he is saying is. To say that what matters in life, in experience, is relationship. And it's almost like he's saying it's all that matters. I don't think he wants to say that. I mean, I know a couple of facts about him, and it's described in Louis Jacobs' explanation there. Like, he liked to wear fancy ties. I mean, he wasn't opposed. He didn't think of the world in such a way that he needed to kind of renounce objective reality. That's not who he was. But he also understood that we're better people by cultivating I thou. And that's also, you notice how he solved the problem? At once we completely know God. We understand religion. And if we are made, and then if we want to express that, right? Let me give it to you a different way. 1 second, okay? Buber might have said, he may have said this someplace in his writing. How would we understand the Israelite people at Mount Sinai? It's an I thou moment between the people and God. In other words, Torah was the objectification of the moment, which is why Torah is what it is. It's it. But the experience is so profound that you want to maintain that experience, but you can't. So what do? You construct an entire ritual behavior, all in the hopes of recapturing some aspect of that profound experience. You create an entire tradition, a whole literature, so that that moment, which we call for convenience sake Sinai, is perpetuated, or at least remembered. Right? And so what does religion become? Organized religion becomes what happens after you can't maintain the I-thou relationship. And you develop all of these structures to kind of perpetuate it. I may not have said that the best way possible, but I promised 1, 2, and there may be another. Yeah. I think, frankly, that's too reductionist, meaning I don't think he thinks it's just the difference between rationality and emotion. He wants to say that, I believe, the way I'm reading it, that there are two different kinds of knowing. And I-thou is knowing. I didn't just randomly pick the phrase, I know my wife. Right? I think we all say that, and when we say it, we don't mean facts about that person. I picked that on purpose because I'm hoping that that would communicate something of what I think is the profound difference. Okay, yeah. It's not the way I would put it, okay? But that doesn't mean you're wrong. I think what you initially started to describe was more what Abraham Joshua Heschel was talking about. The moment of wonder, of profound amazement that there's anything, and especially this thing. And then he thought now you're on the path, just like you said. When you kept talking and then you said, but you can fall out of it into description, I think that is what Buber was talking about. They're not the same. They really aren't the same. I don't think they even would have had much to say to each other. Heschel was profoundly traditional. Buber is antinomian. Buber doesn't care much about Jewish law. You don't see anything in here about Jewish law. Whereas Heschel lived his life according to Jewish law. But they are both religious existentialists. Well, I just used it as an example. He thought that you could have a relationship with a tree that's I thou. It's not radical amazement. It's I thou, just like your relationship with your spouse you can have with your tree. We think of it as really only making sense with animate living things, right? But his argument, he would have said with a stone. Right? There are two ways to relate to everything. Relation is everything. Two ways to do it. I it, I thou. Did I see other? Yes, okay. I'll get to you in a second, Fran. That's because you're relating to her as a subject. What you are trying to do in succeeding is not to relate to her as an object, as a collection of symptoms. You are addressing her. You are addressing her, not describing her. Okay? Does that at all clarify it all? Or does it just make it cloudier? Fran. It's all the same God. So I think that Buber would say it may superficially seem to be different, but they're all, every I thou relationship regardless is a result of the eternal thou, God.
I understand that. What I was trying to do perhaps is to use it as a bridge to address
Okay, so that, I appreciate that. Okay, so that's why I brought up Sinai. Because our experience in the Jewish tradition, which we encapsulate in Sinai, then led to a whole tradition. If you would look in Christianity, and you assume Buber is correct, their experience led to a different version of experience. Okay? And Islam or Hinduism or whatever it is, he wants to argue it's all the same. Remember, everybody has a different name, but they're all addressing the eternal thou. The after effects of it, of the experience, is going to be processed and developed differently by each person and each community. And so, if I'm hearing you correctly, I think he would argue that the common point is the relationship experience. But then where it goes, that will be different over time. Because it's also like a wheel. It keeps rolling on itself, right? So Jewish tradition wasn't just the result of Sinai, but now of multiple kinds of things over time. And the same thing with every other religious tradition. I think it's a productive way of thinking about our experience of God that you don't get from anybody else. Yes. As I said, this is doing something that can't be done. It's the same thing happens when I think I mentioned this last week, when you read Immanuel Kant, and he's trying to tell you, the critique of pure reason is he's trying to explain the processes of experience through the human mind. But he can't obviously step out of it and look at it and describe it, but that's what he's trying to do. And so you keep running into this. Oh, he's saying this, but does he really? Because he's trying to do something that by its very nature can't be done. But it seems like it can be done, that if you skirt around it enough and talk enough about it and give enough examples and analogies and the like, people, if it's about experience, will go, I think I understand that experience now. I've had that experience. Now, do I think it's as important as he did? Do I think that I build an entire life based on this experience, the way he's arguing? Okay, that you have to evaluate for yourself, but at least you have a sense of what he meant. Okay, I want to do another couple minutes, and then we need to move to something, as they say, entirely different. Yes? I don't think that's Immanuel Kant, but it's not important. Yeah. Yeah, so I just was trying to make the point, but we don't have to stay fixed on the I, thou with inanimate objects. That may be, a step too far for most of us. How do you have an I, thou with a stone? Okay, but you can get his point if you just focus on human experience. Okay, are we ready to try something entirely different? Okay. Have we heard of Mordecai Kaplan? What I'm trying to expose you to are the thinkers that, if you want to understand a lot about American Judaism, even now, in the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century, knowing these pivotal thinkers from the early and middle parts of the 20th century in America and their influence, I think is necessary if you want to understand things today. Nobody in the early part of the 20th century, no Jewish thinker, in my view, had more influence than Mordecai Kaplan. Mordecai Kaplan. Also, he lived a really long time, so he had a lot of students. It actually, when this book is published in 1970 or 72, he's still alive. He was born in 1881. He lived to be, I think, 101, 102. I heard him as a very elderly man in Jerusalem the last time, and I think that was in the I think it was late 70s or early 80s. Why was he so significant? Well, to start with, he taught at Jewish Theological Seminary. And unlike today, the largest movement in American Jewish life was the conservative movement. Today, sadly in my opinion, and I am sure there will be people that would take issue with this, the conservative movement is disintegrating and disappearing before our very eyes. But it was not always so. Early in the 20th century, the conservative movement was the perfect movement for the mass immigration out of Eastern Europe. I'm specifically thinking of my grandmother. So when my grandmother got here and lived in this little town in Iowa, and she came, I think she was 15 when she got here, so she should have had a very thick Yiddish accent, but she was determined not to be a Greena. In English, we say greenhorn. And I knew her to speak English in a completely natural, flat, Midwestern Iowa accent because she was determined. And so she wanted to be modern, which meant orthodoxy wasn't going to do it for her. Not real orthodoxy. On the other hand, Reform, liberal Judaism, these people initially, in her opinion, had to have been just this side of Christianity, of apostates. My mother told me that when she went into a Reform synagogue for the first time, and the rabbi was not wearing a kippah, she was certain he was going to be struck dead on the bima. And she didn't mean that as a joke. Because on the one hand, they didn't want to be Orthodox, but on the other hand, they were afraid of giving up their identity and their heritage and their tradition. And who was more or less in the middle? The conservative movement, which looked very traditional, but also was modern in terms of its educational style and its goals and the like. And so the conservative movement greatly appealed to all those Eastern Europeans that poured into the United States. And by the way, the Reform movement was thrilled with this because the Reform movement didn't want them anyway. I'm going to be, I said this last time, Karen, one of the advantages of being retired is you can say pretty much anything you want. I didn't realize it was streaming last week, so God knows who saw this. But, but the Reform movement, which were overwhelmingly Germans, looked down on the Eastern Europeans. You know that in Dayton. There was, the Eastern European Jewish town club and the German town, or the country club. It was true in every town, in every single town. And so it was Reform Jews that built Jewish Theological Seminary for the conservative movement, so that those people would have some place to go. It's really a sad piece of our history, but we ought to own up to it. Anyway, so it was a huge movement. And here you have this guy teaching for decades and decades to conservative rabbis. It's also, by the way, the reason why Abraham Joshua Heschel was influential. He taught there also, teaching at Jewish Theological Seminary. But the popular guy, the guy with the influence was Mordecai Kaplan. Now, what Mordecai Kaplan is interested in, the reason he had such influence, since this is not so much what we're going to look at here, is because he had a basic idea that, lo and behold, everybody in the Jewish world agreed to. To my knowledge, there are no ideas like that everybody in the Jewish world agrees to, but this comes the closest. He wrote a seminal work called Judaism as a Civilization, in which it's a very big book, but essentially what he is arguing, this key idea, is that all you people are arguing about Jewish religion. You Reform Jews, you wrote a platform called the Pittsburgh Platform that says what you believe, and Orthodox Jews argue that they believe the traditional stuff about God giving the Torah word for word on Mount Sinai, and you're arguing this, you're arguing that, all you are arguing theology and religion and the like, but what really matters is that Judaism is a civilization. That was his term. My term would be culture. Judaism is a culture. It's languages and it's art and it's history and it's artifacts and it's religious ideas and it's calendar and it's languages. It's the whole thing, the whole schmear is what Judaism really is, and we need to start acting as if Judaism is a civilization and not just argue over who's right about what theological religious tenet. He argued that every synagogue should be a Jewish community center. Every synagogue should have a swimming pool. I think he was right. I think we made a huge mistake as a community when we chose to separate that aspect of Jewish life, the so-called communal life, from the synagogue life. And some of us, certainly I for 40 years, and I know that my successor is continuing this, have been trying to build Jewish community, Jewish culture, Jewish civilization in the synagogue. Isn't that what we really do? Okay. So imagine how radical it was in the early 20th century when he came up with this idea that we have to focus on Judaism as a civilization. There are Reform rabbis that were Kaplanian. There were even Orthodox rabbis that in this regard were Kaplanian, and many, many conservative rabbis, influential, who were Kaplanian. Some of you may have heard of Roland Gittleson. He was a past president of the CCAR. He wrote all sorts of religious school texts. Consecrated Unto Me is the one that I had to read when I was in confirmation class. You may have heard of Harold Schulweis in California. You may have heard for sure of Harold Kushner. They're all Kaplanians. If you want to go home and get off your shelf when bad things happen to good people and reread it, it's just pure Kaplan. Harold Schulweis sold all the books, and he wrote it, and he told all the stories, and out of his life and his career in a most compelling way. But the idea is they're all Kaplan. Okay. Are we ready now to look at this? Because I want to look at what he has to say about God. Everybody found it? Whatever the general idea we hold in our minds and regard as pointing to or representative of reality or of any phase of it derives from something seen, heard, felt, believed, or assumed, the fact is true also of the belief in God. In most religions of the past, that belief was derived from traditions concerning self-revelations of God through visions. Those traditions are now discounted by all who have become habituated to scientific and philosophic thought. Who does he see as the major challenge to Judaism in the early 20th century? Science and philosophy. It's undermining what we now would call Orthodox Judaism. Those basic ideas of the Jewish people standing at Mount Sinai and receiving the Torah, Moses on top of it. Any of you have been in any of my classes, you see me draw my little stick figure thing of the mountain and Moses on top receiving the commandments from the capital G up in the sky, which is essentially Orthodox Judaism says that's all been undermined. Let's just face up to it. If you look on the next page, those who are not content with the superficiality of merely rejecting a belief that has been so universal, spontaneous, and persistent as belief in God have turned their attention to the study of human nature and its needs. They have rightly concluded that there must be something in the very nature of man which has led him to create the vast and complex edifice of religion with its creeds, rituals, institutions, and politics, civilization. What is that something? Some maintain that religion is the product of fear, of whatever is beyond man's control, and that it is nothing but a disguised form of primitive magic to which man resorted. Someone like Sigmund Freud would have said that. Where did I lose? Whatever. Expecting the supposed gods, demons, spirits, and angels to fulfill his wishes. As man learns to bring under control more and more of the forces in his own body and his environment, he feels he can dispense with religion. What he cannot control, he has to accept with resignation. Others, however, and I among them, Kaplan, assume that man, once his physiological needs are satisfied, begins to experience the need to overcome such traits as self-indulgence, arrogance, envy, exploitation, and hatred, or to bring under control the aggressive forces of his nature. That constitutes man's true destiny. Therein lies his salvation. What is salvation? Self-improvement. Overcoming the bad stuff in all of our personalities. That is salvation. Not at all what the tradition says is salvation. What is salvation in the tradition? The ingathering of the exiles, the resurrection of the dead, the final judgment in God's kingdom on earth. Nothing like that. No magic, no miracles. Salvation is overcoming the bad stuff within us. Aggression, envy, you name it. We just went through the long list all day on Yom Kippur, over and over again. Okay? So if you look on page 24, from that point it is natural to arrive at the next step, which requires no blind leap into the dark. The next step is to conclude that the cosmos is so constituted as to enable man to fulfill his highest human need, the highest human need of his nature. Remember in Milton Steinberg, he argued that the universe is a cosmos and not chaos? He was Kaplan's student. Kaplan argues that the universe makes sense, and that if our goal as human beings, and we're part of the universe, is to reach our highest self, then the universe must be so composed as to help us. That's his faith. That's his religion. No reaction. Okay. He's going to give you an example. Let's see what you think of this. A magnetic needle hung on a thread or placed on a pivot assumes of its own accord a position in which one end of the needle points north and the other south. So long as it is free to move about, all attempts to deflect it will not get it to remain away from its normal direction. Likewise, man normally veers in the direction of that which makes for the fulfillment of his destiny as a human being. That fact indicates the functioning of a cosmic power which influences his behavior. What magnetism is to the magnetic needle, godhood or God is to man. There you have it. Told you it was very different. Marcia got a look on her face like she just ate a persimmon that wasn't ripe. Who? I didn't hear the first part. Oh, evil people think the same thing, in other words. Yeah, okay. So, I on purpose called this his faith. Let's see if I can explain this. Let me try to work around it a little bit. Remember, he's trying to create a kind of Judaism that is not only cognizant of its past as a civilization, but also is not at loggerheads with science, is not at loggerheads with philosophy. He wants to create a modern Judaism, and by the way, there are plenty of Jews that still want this, that is in harmony with science. Most of us solve that problem as science talks about how, religion talks about why. But if you want to be a little, not so flip about it, he's trying to tell you what is the job of religion and who or what is God within that scheme. All that makes sense scientifically. So he uses a scientific, quasi-scientific argument, right? Can anybody taste magnetism? See it, touch it, smell it, hear it? How do we know it? Right? We can't use any of our senses. Is there anybody here who does not believe in magnetism? So why do we believe it if we can't see it or touch it or smell it or hear it or taste it? We see the results. Right. Okay, so let's say that human beings are the needle. Right? That's the needle. We see the results that there must be a force in nature pulling that needle north. Okay. He's arguing that there must be a force in nature pulling us, human beings, towards salvation. And what is salvation? Self-improvement, self-actualization, reaching our potential. Can we see it or touch it or smell it or hear it or taste it? No. But if we look at human beings, we can reason back that it must be there. There must be a power that makes for salvation, just like there is a power that we call magnetism. And just like we know about magnetism by looking at the needle, we know about the power that makes for salvation by looking at human beings striving for salvation. It's a whole different way of thinking about faith. Because, of course, whoever said that, Marcia, you said, there are bad people, right? There are people who would say they're striving for salvation, but we don't accept that definition of salvation, right? But he's very optimistic. Remember the early 20th century, which he's still a product of the 19th century. And the 19th century was all about optimism, that the world was getting better. By the way, it's the foundation of Reform Judaism. What did Reform Jews say? When we got rid of the personal Messiah, what did we say? Yeah. Messianic age. What on earth made us believe that human beings are headed towards a messianic age? Because in the 19th century, we believed that the world was inevitably getting better. Problems developed. The Shoah, Hiroshima, a few other things, you know. The never again mantra has been put to the lie every 5 minutes since the Second World War. Okay? But in the 19th century, the early 20th century, his religious faith was this optimism. That's why I argue Reform Jews are incredibly optimistic and full of faith. Even the people who claim they don't believe. When we, proclaim that we're working towards the Messianic age, we have, because of the impact of Hebrew in the state of Israel, a good thing in my opinion, we now talk about tikkun olam. But what makes us think that we're actually tikkuning the olam? Really, what makes us think that? If you're objective, do you see it? Of course we see examples of it. And for us, the question is, what are we going to focus on? What are we going to care about? What's going to be our guiding light, as opposed to all the rest? Okay, but for him, the beginning of the 20th century, he sees this as a matter of religious faith, that there is salvation, if you will, for humanity, if not for yes, also for a given individual, if that individual achieves maximum potential. But we can move towards it. But he thinks, this is the religious part, that there is a force in the universe propelling us in that direction. Like science. Yes? I couldn't hear you. Well, he doesn't talk about it. You would have to decide about that. All right? You could argue that, which is dualism in essence. That's Zoroastrianism. That's that there's a good God and a bad God. But both of them would be forces still. It would be much more like Star Wars. Right? What is the essence of Star Wars? Yeah, there's the Force and the dark side. But they're not individuals. They're not beings. They're part of nature. Okay, I saw a hand for a second. Read it. Okay. Well, and the problem with this is, do we really buy into this optimism on any level? Okay. And there have been critics who have said, how do you pray to this force? What's the point? And he's going to argue that prayer is not really about talking to God, it's about talking to ourselves. It's about encouraging the self-development. So let's look at the bottom of page 24. No, I read that already. Let's look at the bottom of 25. There is, to be sure, a large element of faith in the foregoing type of analogical reasoning. But it is the kind of faith without which we could not live. When we count upon the sun's rising tomorrow morning, we act upon that kind of indispensable faith. Do we know for sure the sun will rise tomorrow? We know it has every other day, but that's not absolute proof that it will again. It's a kind of faith to believe in it. You cannot compare that kind of faith to faith in the biblical story that the sun stood still. Likewise, you cannot say that faith in God as a process that makes man's salvation possible is as unprovable as faith in an anthropomorphic God. For that matter, the human person, too, is not a ghost double of each of us that walks out on us when we go to bed. The human person, too, is part of the salvation-making process and is as much an object of faith as is God. Now, he's going to go on to talk about that a little more. Who's ever seen a soul? Touched it, not of your shoe, thank you. Touched it, that's what teaching confirmation was like. Touched it, smelled it, heard it. Now, there's no objective criteria for a soul, but most people are certainly willing to use the word, and they think that the word has meaning, and many people would argue that it's a real thing, a soul. Because it too, he would say, is part of the force that moves us towards salvation, that moves us towards self-actualization. It's the animating force in each individual. And if you want to expand that, I don't know that he says it's certainly not here, we talk about the kind of soul of a people, right? Or of a group. They have certain characteristics, certain kind of approach, a kind of soul. And don't we mean the same thing? It's the animating principle of whatever it is that's propelling that group forward. Okay. So we can read a little bit more, but I'm also interested in hearing what you all have to say. So let's look at the last paragraph. All the theologians who deprecate the naive conception of God as an anthropomorphic being virtually do not themselves believe in God as an identifiable being or entity. When they denounce the notion of God as process, because he had a lot of critics. As a matter of fact, the Orthodox put his prayer book in cherem. They never did that with our prayer books. In cherem. They banned his prayer book, not just in Boston. Our prayer books, they thought that we're completely wrong, but our prayer books talk about the traditional Jewish God more or less and is theistic, and so they never banned our prayer books, but Mordecai Kaplan's prayer book, you can see, is not very theistic, is it? Okay, when we denounce the notion of God as process, they apparently try to convey the impression that their own idea of God is at least comprehensible. Actually, they keep on stressing at the same time that God is absolutely unknowable, inscrutable, ineffable. They use the very terms in which the agnostic Herbert Spencer long ago described God. They keep on repeating that we can know God only through his manifestations, or that he reveals himself not in objects but in events. What are manifestations and events if not process? In other words, doesn't the tradition do the same thing? They just ascribe personhood to God. These theologians are merely hurling at the notion of God as process the same anathemas that have been hurled at the God idea of the medieval theologians by the naive pietists who conceived of God in human form. We can unpack that, but I really don't think that there's much new there. What you should also know is that his ideas were so influential it led to an entire movement. It's a tiny movement, but a movement. What's that movement? The Reconstructionist Movement. It has its seminary in Philadelphia. Actually, one of my classmates who went to school with me at HUC was president at one time. But today, the Reconstructionist movement, by and large, I would suggest, has moved pretty far away from Mordecai Kaplan. So when you talk about the Reconstructionist movement, you might well ask people, are you X? Is that person an Orthodox Kaplanian? I know that sounds weird. Or something more contemporary in terms of where the movement has grown anyway, the seminary opened up in 1969, if I remember right. So you can get an idea how it's developed. But Mordechai Kaplan is the intellectual founder. His students, the people he influenced, produced the money to create the movement. Tiny, relatively speaking. So the Reform movement still claims, if you can't tell that I should be putting everything in air quotes and everything with a sense of irony, I'm going to say it out loud. Everything is in air quotes and should be with a sense of irony. The Reform movement claims 1.5 million adherents in the United States and some, 850 congregations? Something like that. Remember, this is just my opinion. The Reconstructionist movement maybe is 100 entities, congregations, chavarot, maybe even 150, but more likely 70, some number, and then the appropriate total number underneath it. Indeed, in the World Union for Progressive Judaism, which is our international arm, the Reconstructionists sit with us as part of the World Union for Progressive Judaism. Yeah, so something that was identified as a bat mitzvah, not what we identify as a bat mitzvah here at Temple Israel. But she was the first one. Mordechai Kaplan's daughter, because as a civilization, he, in a way, because remember, we're talking about over 100 years ago, he was egalitarian. Right? He saw that as the coming wave. And as I said, he was a very persuasive teacher, and he had huge influence. I can't point to anybody else who created a movement, with perhaps the exception of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, if you consider Chabad a movement. They're certainly as big as the Reconstructionists, that's for sure. And he was a similar kind of visionary in terms of having ideas that were not only intellectual ideas, but programmatic ideas that got implemented that had a profound impact on the Jewish world. You can decide for yourself whether it was good, bad, or indifferent, but a profound impact. Okay, so Kaplan is arguing an entirely different thing than Buber. Buber is working from experience. Kaplan is moving again into the realm of ideas, and he sees the problem as the challenge of science. How many of our own people to this day feel that they are not religious because they are scientific? Meaning they accept science. Now, they may not articulate it this way, but this still is a challenge for a lot of people who are only familiar with kind of the old man in the sky version of theology and the Orthodox stories of what constitutes Torah and tradition. And so therefore, if they don't believe those, and they do believe in scientific principles and in scientific reasoning and the scientific method, then they obviously aren't religious. Kaplan is trying to show that that does not have to be that way. And that's, I believe, what made him so persuasive in the beginning of the 20th century. It's sort of interesting in an exact, almost reverse way. We once again are fighting the battles of science versus religion. Various orthodoxies versus science. In American culture. In American culture, we're fighting them all over again. What is the source of truth? Is it revealed religion, revealed text? Or is it scientific rationale and method? We're still fighting this. So I don't know that Kaplan is irrelevant, even if I personally don't find his thinking theologically to be of the greatest import. That's just personal. I think it's why, I'll tell a story that was once told to me by, as they called themselves, UUs. Do you know what UUs are? Right. Unitarian Universalists. Who once told me, they asked me to do a series of lectures when I was living in Lancaster in the west of Philadelphia. It was sort of close to me. And I did this series of lectures, and they told me if I wanted to understand UUs, I should understand this story. That there was a group of Unitarian Universalists who had died, and they were all together in the afterlife, and they were all together, they were about to die, and they were all together, and the minister said to them, behind you are two doors. One door leads to heaven, and the other door leads to a discussion about heaven. You choose. And they all went to the second door. Okay. Now, that was my experience also with Unitarian Universalists, at least in the limited amount that I encountered with them. But the same thing is happening here with Reconstructionists. They would rather teach about Judaism and Torah than pray. That's been my experience of Reconstructionists. Not all, not every circumstance. I'm generalizing, I understand that. But Kaplan's thinking works much better as an approach to Jewish life, to civilization, than it does specifically to prayer. Because prayer, as Buber would have said, is addressing the thou, naming the thou. And if you think that this is a process, a power, a force that makes for salvation, it's sort of hard to do that address. I didn't hear you. Okay. Buber would have said, anytime you're in an I-thou relationship, you're addressing God. It's a kind of prayer. Whether it's a tree, a stone, or a person. So as I said, Buber was sort of antinomian. He never would have said you have to pray 3 times a day and these are the words that you have to use, although he knew them all. He knew them all. But do you follow what I'm saying? Whereas a force, that's a little difficult. It's like praying to the force in Star Wars. No, you learn to manipulate it. You learn what it's trying to say to you, but you don't pray to it. Joel. Yeah, they're all part of the civilization. The literature is an important part of the civilization. He was actually a pretty traditional Jew himself. And radical. So, if you know a Hebrew prayer past the Shema, the Nevi'ah Hafta, it may well be the blessing before the reading of Torah. Right? We learned that at our bat mitzvah, at our bar mitzvah. And it seems to be universal, right? Baruch et Adonai Amvarach, Baruch Adonai Amvarach le'olam va'ed, Baruch et Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu, which means what? Chosen us mikol ha'amim, from all of the peoples. Well, Kaplan couldn't abide that. He couldn't abide that because he said, yes, we are special to ourselves. This is our civilization. But we can't think that God, the force that makes for salvation, has singled us out and no one else. And he changed it. I don't remember what he changed it to. But he changed it. And that's partly why his book was put in cherem by the Orthodox. And frankly, I don't think it ever really caught on. If you look at the most recent Reconstructionist prayer books, they'll have his version and a traditional version, and the chances are 2 or 3 other versions, because that's the way it rolls today, right? There's always got to be. Man, I almost sprained my wrist holding the book on Yom Kippur. It's literally, I had it sitting on the chair in front of me whenever I sat, because. You all know I didn't vote for that book. All right, anyway, but no, there's a lot of good stuff in it, but in my opinion, where the Union Prayer Book didn't have enough stuff, the Mishkan series has way too much stuff in it. But okay, Believe me, no one is asking my opinion. No one. There's a new Reform prayer book in Israel, and I don't like it either, and no one's asking me my opinion about that either. Yeah. That was the complaint, by the way, about Gates of Prayer, because it had 10 Friday night services and 6, if I remember right, Saturday morning services, and everybody said, after the Union Prayer Book, you know, that nice little pocket thing, it was like, it's way too heavy. It's way too heavy. But it was all in one book. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to get at here in terms of Kaplan is he could be very radical. At the same time, very traditional, because he was standing within the heritage. So he had no complaint with studying the heritage, with learning from it, and the mores of the tradition, which are included in the halacha as the guide for Jewish life. He never said we should change the calendar and make right now Pesach. You know, he knew it was Chag, it was Sukkot, and and that's what we should be celebrating right now, because that's part of the heritage. It's just that it was dynamic. It wasn't static. And as we learn more, as we perfect ourselves more, as we become moving closer to salvation, we need to make adjustments, additions, like changing the blessing before the reading of Torah. I think he actually had a very persuasive argument. The problem is he was coming up against a beloved and well-known, long-standing tradition, right? That's what happens when you come up against these things that are very hard to change. I talked about this with Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur afternoon. The big thing about Kol Nidre is the music, not the words. But we don't change the words, do we? I think you asked a question about, what is this about vows and why are we still saying it? You didn't add that part, I'm adding it. Why are we still saying it? Because none of us pay any attention to the words. But you can't end it. You can't end it because it's so deeply ingrained in the heritage, in the civilization. So I think it's a complicated answer to your question. He can be both radical and very traditional. Anybody else? We have like 2 minutes. No one else? Okay, so next week we are going to look at, what did I say? I think we're going to look, I think we're going to look at Rubinstein and Fackenheim, which is entirely about the problem of evil and the Holocaust. Rubinstein is going to challenge us, and in my opinion, Fackenheim is going to answer the challenge. But we'll see whether you agree or not. Okay? Thank you for coming.